common clergy that was disputing that the reform that they were implying was wrong. And this is like the most prominent sign of the change, that how you need to hold fingers when you pray. So for all believers, this is like a crucial question. Because this movement was opposing to the state and to the official church, of course they were persecuted for most of the history. So in imperial time, in Soviet period, so basically only recently they gained the same rights as other religious groups. And that is why actually the history of all believers is full of denunciation, because like always there was someone who was reporting them for doing something illegal. And in case of all believers, the illegal was different religious practices, like practicing just performing the service, or like baptizing children. Marriage was also illegal. So for all believers it was quite not a very challenging time, especially if we're talking about imperial Russia, because for imperial power all believers, they were schismators, so like they belonged to the Russian church, but they didn't want to abide by the rules. So that's why they didn't have the same rights as the rest. Also, all believer, like actually, it was harsh at that period because religious groups, like so, people were divided into by the religion, and they were supposed to stay within this group. So conversion was something that was not really welcome. Like you could join the Russian Orthodox Church, but if you want to quit, then there's going to be a problem. Also, marriage was basically registered by church authorities, as well as baptism. So this is like when then a child is born. So like all these important things, they were related to church. And if you're an old believer, then you do not go to church. So basically, the children of all believers were considered as bastards, and marriages were not recognized, and this also affected the legal rights and so on and so forth. And on the top of that, quite often when all believers did something, then they were reported to the authorities, and then I will show you later, like there is a pile of criminal cases against all believers that basically were observing what practices they had, like what ritual they performed and why, or what beliefs they had, and so on. So that is why I'm using these criminal cases, although I'm not a historian, but I was curious, like if I can use them as some source of ethnographic knowledge, because the systematic study of all believers happened much later, and if I wanted to know how things were before, I had to basically deal with the sources that are available, and mostly they are related to this denunciation. So here I'm just showing some factions of all belief. So in Estonia there are basically two of those groups, and I hope today you will take a closer look at them. In Siberia, one of the factions I work mostly with is called Chusoviny. This is from Russian Chapel, and another group, Wanderers, they will also appear in my presentation today. So this is just an example of how this denunciation might look like. So this is not like a classical thing when someone complains or files an anonymous report to authorities. That could be so basically this was not considered as denunciation. This was just a publication, so to say, to disapprove the old belief, to show how bad they were, and so on. But at the same time, I think there is an element of denunciation, because here you also show by this publication that like you basically complain about them. You show how disgraceful these old believers are and what they do. So in this case, it's a publication by a high authority, but he was reporting old believers to even higher authorities, like so that they would be sure that old believers are really bad. And so in this case, he was mentioning that like some family members, they bring their daughters to schismatic fathers to the forest, and then they have some fornication there, acts of fornication. They call it Christ's love, but actually it's just a sin. And quite often we can see that in these criminal cases, something is related to fornication. So it was like a common pattern that old believers were committing some kind of, let's say, deviant sexual behavior they had. Yeah, so here is a map just where old believers live. I circled their towns and villages where they reside nowadays with black. And this black arrow here is Orthodox church. Just because it will appear in my further presentation. And here is a picture of old believer women. This is, of course, the prayer clothes, not an everyday one. Yeah, so first example, this is just to show how these criminal cases look like. So it's about conversion of Estonian peasants to this Russian schism. And then another example of a shameful act committed by Agapova and Petrov in Old Believer prayer house during the service. And here I bring this here just to show that it has an element of denunciation, because it all started with the report from the priest of the village Nos that I just showed you. So this one. So and the prayer house was situated in Voronia, or in Estonian Varnia. So basically, kind neighbors they had there. And so you see that this case was lasting for several years. Fortunately to the old believers, it ended up with nothing, because they figure out that these were just rumors, not the actual shameful act that happened. But I bring it, this is just an example to show how this, how often these things were happening in life of old believers, and how this culture of fear it was appeared in their history. So till nowadays, it's quite difficult to work with them, because when you come and ask about their faith, they're quite, let's say, so you have to find your way to be able to speak to them, because they still remember the times, the persecutions, and this is like a common topic that they live in. But my presentation was about the place which is called Us, and this is situated in Siberia. So we're gonna make a bit of a journey. So a Us community appeared in 1860s when a group of old believers settled there from central Russia and western Siberia. And this is actually southern side of Sayan Mountains, a place where like contemporary Krasnoyarsk, so it's a border of contemporary Krasnoyarsk Krai and Tuva Republic. Both are now like regions of Russia. And so, but at that time it was, according to Russian authorities, in no man's land. Of course, there were like local Tuvan aristocracy, and it was under protectorate of China, if I'm not wrong. But it also, at this time, like starting from 1860s, it was the beginning of Russian colonization of that region, of Sayana region. And so I think that is one of the reasons why we at all have anything about these old believers that were one of the first settlers there. So they came there, and several people like wrote about them, and of course a lot of information we have from the missionary Putilov, who came to Us, and he was trying to convert all believers to Orthodoxy, and he was basically like, as we learn from these publications that he made and that were posthumously published, we learned that he was constantly writing to his supervisors, reporting about his actions and denouncing all believers. But then we have some other records. So a small essay by another old believer who wrote about that community. They belong to different factions, so that's why he was not very, let's say, so he used basically the same language as missionaries and Orthodox priests might describe this community. And then we have two ethnographic essays, like which quite often show, like, repeat the same patterns as we can see in that, so to say, primary sources. So what things I found in those records is that basically the idea of that region of Us province, as they called it, or Us region. So in Russian they use the word krai, which is like edge, roughly translated. So it basically appears like. So I wouldn't say that it was an official name. It appears in these records, and it it is described through this community that they came here. They established like a Russian village, and then through the image of this community, you can like grasp on the image of the region. And quite important is the personality of founder of that community. So we see that the story of this founder, Ivan Lipin, it is repeated in the Putilov's and Pugovkin's essays, and also ethnographers Kohn and Adrianov. They pay quite a lot of attention to his personality, and they describe him as a very aggressive and sly person who was not a real believer. So here is an example where they say that he was not a real believer. He just make acquainted with some real believer. He learned some rules, and then he decided to let's say, seduce these people to the schism. So he found some peasants in central Russia and brought them to Siberia. So basically, he lied to them, and this was like another topic in these reports. And I didn't use the word seduce without reason, because this is like an expression that quite often can be seen in such reports on old believers that like you do not baptize your children, you seduce them to schism. So so again, this sexualized language can be found. And so he was said to commit like even killings, because if somebody did not approve his authority, he might be killed, and so on and so forth. So not a very pleasant person, but anyways, he was their religious leader. And further ethnographers will describe that. So they wouldn't doubt that he was like that, but they tried to explain that it was a kind of authority that this community needed, because this is a settlers community, so they come to no man's land, and therefore there is no state, no rules, so just primary instincts, and such person basically personified that authority, and the community itself considered them as considering all his decisions as rightful. But of course, first of all, in such records we do not hear the voice of all believers. So these people also had to work with some so they did some field work, as they claimed, like they had some contacts with these old believers, but still, like we don't know what exactly they told them, and like how true these stories were. So we don't know. We cannot check that. And for me, I think it was one of the so why I used this as an ethnographic topic. To me, it was interesting to understand to what faction these old believers belonged, because Putilov basically said that they were wanderers, and here is some short description of how, how this faction looks like. So they divided into two communities. Like one are real wanderers, and they live in isolation, and then there are the so-called hosts who provide food for them. Like officially, they are not. They do not belong to these like wanderers, but this is a quite important part of this community. And so here now we can read the excerpts from Putilov and Pugovkin's records, how they were trying to describe religious practices of these old believers, claiming that they were wanderers. So Putilov said that they relatives had different surnames. And then he also said that they used the holy gifts, or as they called spare gifts, for Holy Communion. Then another author, Pugovkin, he also reports that these old believers had their own kind of Holy Communion. Basically some bread that they claimed was baked with the crumbs of the previous Holy Communion that was baptized by some pious old believer priests that lived back in the days. And then he also described the consecration of water. And by reading these excerpts, for me it's clear that they couldn't be wanderers, because these old believers do not have such practices. That's why I identify them mostly as Часовенные. So why is that? Because there are two main movements within old belief. So priestless old believers, they do not have priests, and neither they have any Holy Communion. So these wanderers belong to this part of old belief. But Chesoviny, they also do not have priests, but at some point they used to. They are just accustomed to this Holy Communion, and they think that this is possible to multiply it by just baking new bread and using the old crumbs. And they also consecrate water. Of course, again, we cannot claim anything just by using these sources, because the reality is always more complicated than we think, and like we don't know what the identity was. But for me, for me, it was first. This is the case when I can more or less using like the voice of one side of this story to basically to make my own claim and to show that some elements of ethnography, they might help to at least to question the claims that are made by these authors. So that's why I think that this case of Fus community was quite important for me. But I think that at this point I will stop, and I am welcome to. Sorry, you're welcome to ask any questions if you have any.
So thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I think we have still a few minutes for questions. So, yes, please.
Maybe out of curiosity, thank you very much for your presentation. How did you get into the community? Because I assume you conducted field work in this, or your research is more like historically oriented research, or you actually live with them, or yeah. So I'm just curious how you collected data, and if you actually collected it inside, let's say, with them, how easy or difficult was it to speak with them or to make them open for you and for your research?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So I forgot to say that this community doesn't exist anymore. There is a village, even a couple of villages that have the same name, but there are no believers there. So at some point they just moved away, probably because of that stories that were circulating, also thanks to Putilov. But of course there are other communities around in Siberia and here in Estonia, and indeed it's quite difficult, but you have to, like, I wouldn't say that they totally do not want to talk to you, but somehow you have to gain some trust, and of course it's better if you have any acquaintances who might just bring you there. So step by step you can do that, and actually there's quite a lot of researchers of all belief, especially in Russia. So yes, they are kind of a restricted community, but there are more researchers than the all believers, as quite sometimes said. So yeah, it's doable.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And did you come across any denunciation which had anything to do with their relation to Tsarist power? I mean, because most of the unbelievers communities, especially before 1883, when Usinskii, they were given almost the same rights with members of the established church. So many of them refused to pray for the Tsar, because considered the Tsar as the embodiment of Antichrist. So was there any denunciation regarding this kind of attitude towards Tsarist power?
Of course, but yeah, so all believers actually at least at imperial time, they were divided into non-harmful sects and like harmful sects, and harmful sects included factions that did not want pray for the Tsar. So of course we can find denunciations related to that. But to be honest, I mostly work with those who prayed for the Tsar. So it's maybe a bit an exaggeration that most of them were not praying for him, but or her. So yeah, like even in Soviet times, I think they used some kind of prayer for the power. Well, I think that was not so particular, but at least like you pray for the authority, and by this you recognize it. So yeah, it's just depending on what faction we talking to.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.